This is SuperYacht News. In association with Go Earth, navigating boat buyers to better deals.
Hi, welcome back to the channel. Welcome back to Sicily in Italy. We're here covering the raising or the salvage of the sailing yacht Bayesian, as you probably already know. Now, as you may or may not already know, that the Marine Accident Investigation Branch in the UK has released an interim report into the sinking of the Bayesian yacht. We've had a lot of people asking us after the posting of the last video when we're going to do a video on that subject. Now, we were planning to do a video talking about the lawyer that's been hired to represent the chef who died on board, Ricardo Thomas. That's been postponed because the interim report came out as we were filming the last video. Now, we didn't post a video yesterday because we've been working on this video. It's quite a lot of information to go through. What we've done is we've created a reconstruction of events based on the timeline that's in this report. We're going to play that for you in a second. Now, there's a few things to pay attention to. Now, the timeline is being created from a lot of information that the MAIB's had access to. Obviously, they've had witness testimony from the crew of the Bayesian, the guests and the owner, the crew of the other yacht that was there at the time, the Sir Robert Baden-Powell. Now, information like factual information, like what time the engines shut down, when the lights went out, things like that, that will have been recorded on board the vessel's systems. They have something called a AMS system, alarm and monitoring system, which is a series of computers. You have one in the engine room, one on the bridge, and it records everything. So when you turn the engines on, what times they shut off, you know, if there's fuel starvation, whatever it is that's controlled by the ship systems is recorded in these files on those computers, and they have access to that. So that will confirm things like when engines started and when the emergency lights came on and things like that. Now, the report does note that they've had restricted access to the wreck of the Bayesian because of the Italian criminal investigation. And they also say that the assessment of Bayesian's capsize is based on available documents and information that will be validated and as necessary, iterated and improved following detailed examination of the wreck once salvaged. In other words, it will either confirm or they'll change it and update it once they've examined the wreck. But they say readers are cautioned that there is the possibility that new evidence may become available that might alter the circumstances as depicted in this report. Now, before we go into the reconstruction, one other thing to mention on the other side of this bit you're going to watch, which is about 15 minutes long, we're going to talk about they created a digital version of the yacht. They got the University of Southampton to do this, a specialist department there, and they put in all the information from the stability booklet that was issued, that every vessel has, that's issued by the manufacturer. They put that into a computer and then they ran simulations on it to see how the yacht would behave. We're going to talk about that on the other side. We're also going to talk about what this series of events confirms or refutes based on the things that we knew before, or the things that we talked about before we got this timeline. We'll play that for you now.
On the 14th of August 2024, the privately owned and operated yacht Bayesian sailed from the port of Milazzo for a short excursion around the Aeolian Islands and the north coast of Sicily. There were 12 guests and 10 crew on board. The intention was to disembark the guests on the 19th of August before proceeding to Naples for a period of maintenance. On the 18th of August, the Bayesian was anchored at Cefalù on the north coast of Sicily. With the winds increasing, it was decided to motor towards Porticello, 25 nautical miles away to the west, to anchor for the night. This was both to shelter from the forecasted weather and to allow for easy disembarkation of guests the following day. At 21:24 hours, Bayesian anchored to the east of the main breakwater. The centreboard was in the raised position. The yacht Sir Robert Baden-Powell was also at anchor nearby. The seas were calm and there was a very light wind from the northwest. Thunderstorms had been forecast and those on board Bayesian could see the occasional flashes of lightning away to the west. Bayesian's skipper left instructions to be woken by the overnight watchkeepers, deckhands DH1 and DH2, if the wind speed increased above 20 knots or if there were signs that Bayesian was dragging anchor. Having checked the latest weather forecast, the skipper then went to bed. At midnight 30 hours, the last guest had retired, leaving deckhand 1 and the evening steward 1 on duty. At 0100 hours, DH2 deckhand 2 took over the watch from DH1. The wind at this time was noted as being no more than 8 knots. There were no signs of Bayesian dragging anchor. At 0300 hours, deckhand 2 noted the wind as being at 8 knots from the west, but thought that the thunderclouds and lightning seemed to be getting closer. At about 0330 hours, 2 of the guests, G1 and G2, guest 1 and guest 2, awoke but remained resting in their cabin. At approximately 0355 hours, deckhand 2 videoed the advancing storm and posted it to his social media feed. Deckhand 2 then went onto the deck and closed the forward hatches and cockpit windows to protect Bayesian's interior from the rain that had started. Deckhand 2 noted that the wind had picked up to 30 knots and was broad on the port bow. Bayesian was now listing to starboard and deckhand 2 thought the vessel was dragging its anchor. Around 0357, both Bayesian and Sir Robert Baden-Powell started dragging their anchors in the rapidly worsening weather. Around 0400 hours, deckhand 2 ran below and woke the skipper. Together they returned to the flying bridge. At about the same time, the chief engineer woke up. Having experienced bad weather at anchor before, the chief engineer got up and walked to the engine room to prepare the vessel for manoeuvring. After making sure that all 3 generators were running, the chief engineer then went to the wheelhouse to start the steering pumps and hydraulic pumps for the controllable pitch propeller. The chief officer, chief steward, chef and stewards had all been woken by the yacht's change in motion. They dressed and made their way to the crew accommodation. At this time, Bayesian was estimated by those on board to be listing between 10 degrees and 20 degrees to starboard. The owner started to make her way to the flying bridge to see if the taxis that were arranged for 0 to 800 hours would have been cancelled due to the weather. The chief steward secured some loose items in the crew mess area, then went to the upper deck to secure other items. The chief officer went to the flying bridge, where the skipper gave an instruction for the rest of the crew to be woken as the anchor was dragging. Returning below, the chief officer told the bosun and deckhand 1 to go on deck and secure any loose items and stand by for further orders. The chef was in the galley stowing cutlery, pots and pans and shouted "Good morning" to the chief officer and the nearby stewards. Bayesian was lying with the winds around 60 degrees off the port bow and moving at 1.8 knots south-southeast of its original position. Sir Robert Baden-Powell was also dragging its anchor at a similar rate and in a similar direction. 2 of the guests, G3 and G4, had been woken as Bayesian took on the list and decided to head to the saloon with their baby. The chief officer returned to the flying bridge and briefed the skipper on the crew activities. The skipper told the chief officer to check to see if the chief engineer had started the engines and pumps so that they could manoeuvre Bayesian into the wind. On arriving at the wheelhouse, the chief officer saw the chief engineer there and was informed that Bayesian was ready to manoeuvre. The chief officer then shouted up to the flying bridge to inform the skipper. The owner, G3 and G4, carrying G5, arrived in the salon and wheelhouse area as the rain-soaked chief steward came in from the upper deck. As the skipper prepared to manoeuvre Bayesian up into the wind from their position on the flying bridge, the wind suddenly increased to more than 70 knots. The awning over the flying bridge ripped from port to starboard. At 4:06, Bayesian violently heeled over to 90 degrees to starboard, taking less than 15 seconds to do so. People, furniture and loose items fell across the deck. Generators shut down immediately and battery-supplied emergency lighting came on. The skipper, G4, the owner, the bosun and steward 2 were all injured, either by falling or by things falling on them. Deckhand 2 had been thrown into the sea from his position by the helm on the flying bridge. In their cabin, G1 and G2 used the furniture drawers as an improvised ladder to exit the space, escaping along the internal walls of the central alleyway and climbing out onto the salon area. Steward 1 and Deckhand 1 climbed up the walls of the forward staircase, exiting from the crew mess area into the wheelhouse. There was no indication of flooding inside Bayesian until water came in over the starboard rails and within seconds entered the internal spaces down the stairwells. The chief engineer managed to exit through the port forward wheelhouse door. Once clear, he helped Deckhand 1 out before heading aft to launch an emergency position indicating radio beacon, one of 2 on board, from its position on the port aft quarter of the main deck. Deckhand 1 stayed by the port forward wheelhouse door and, reaching down through the open doorway, lifted Steward 1 and then Steward 2 onto the upper deck. Looking down through the door, Deckhand 1 could not see anyone else, so the 3 of them made their way aft into the sea. Separately, the chief officer found the owner and pushed her through the cascading water up to the skipper on the flying bridge. The chief officer and skipper managed to evacuate G3 and G5 by the same route. The bosun and Deckhand 2 climbed down into the wheelhouse and lifted guest 1 and guest 2 into the flying bridge, where they were joined by guest 4, assisted by the chief officer and skipper. With Bayesian rotating to starboard and sinking, the chief steward, bosun and Deckhand 2 found themselves in an air pocket by the closed port forward wheelhouse door. With the assistance of the injured guest 4 on the outside, they were able to open the door and escape. The chief officer had been swept to the back of the saloon and into another air pocket, dived down to open the sliding doors at the aft end of the saloon, and managed to swim clear of the vessel. The skipper organised the abandonment from the flying bridge and instructed the guests and crew present to swim clear of the mast and boom as the vessel was sinking. At 0422, the chief engineer had launched the EPIRB and was sitting on the hull near the rudder. He noted that the wind had eased and that Bayesian was only a short distance from shore. The chief engineer heard shouts from the skipper and jumped into the sea and swam towards the gathering survivors. The chief steward counted those present and checked for injuries. Deckhand 2 improvised a tourniquet for G4's slashed arm, and G2 made sure that G5 had a cushion as a flotation device. Some of the survivors were treading water and others held on to cushions that had floated free from Bayesian. Guest 1 was using the torch from their phone to search the water for other survivors. The skipper and Deckhand 1 swam to Bayesian and attempted without success to release the port aft life raft from its stowage. The chief officer swam to the port forward life raft and released it from a sinking wreck. They towed the life raft to the gathered survivors. At approximately 0424, the life raft was inflated and Deckhand 1 boarded it and assisted the survivors in the water to board. From the life raft, the chief steward saw the bow of Bayesian rise up and then sink below the surface. Chief officer and chief steward began organising the life raft and delivered first aid to those injured people on board. Chief engineer searched for flares and Deckhand 1 and the skipper tried to raise the alarm by shouting at and then paddling towards Sir Robert Baden-Powell. Bayesian had sunk in approximately 50 metres of water. The skipper on board Sir Robert Baden-Powell noted that despite the application of engine power, the vessel had dragged anchor around 400 metres in 11 minutes. The yacht's crew initially thought that Bayesian had put to sea to avoid the sudden storm. The skipper briefly saw a dark triangular shape descending into the water, later believing this to be Bayesian's bow sinking. At 0434, Bayesian's chief engineer fired a red parachute flare from the life raft. Despite the winds being calm at the surface, the flare was carried sideways as it rose up into an area of stronger wind. The chief engineer used the life raft's torch to signal towards a hotel on the cliffs above, passing cars and Sir Robert Baden-Powell. At 0443, the chief engineer fired a second parachute flare that was seen by the crew of Sir Robert Baden-Powell. Responding to the flare, the skipper of Sir Robert Baden-Powell dispatched his tender, towards the visible lights of the EPIRB and life raft. On arrival, the tender's crew transferred the life raft's occupants on board. At 04:53, the tender returned to Sir Robert Baden-Powell. A brief search was made of the accident site to check for other survivors. At 04:56, tender from Sir Robert Baden-Powell returned to the scene with Bayesian's chief engineer on board to search for other survivors. After approximately 20 minutes, the tender returned to Sir Robert Baden-Powell and Bayesian's skipper joined the crew on the tender to continue the search. Sir Robert Baden-Powell's skipper called the local Coast Guard to arrange the transfer of survivors to shore. The accident on Bayesian resulted in the deaths of 6 guests and 1 crew member. All of the bodies were subsequently recovered by local authorities.
So Bayesian was built in 2008. When they build a sailing yacht, or any vessel has a stability information booklet, an SIB, this has to be approved by the flag state. Right. So in this particular instance, the Large Yacht Code 2, as it was at the time, approved the yacht's stability information booklet. However, a sailing yacht generally has to have something called a curve of statical stability, or a GZ curve, or GZ curve from the US, which basically means that if a vessel goes over at 90 degrees, it can right itself back up, right? Now, some of smaller yachts, racing yachts and things like that, they have 130 degrees, which means they can actually go over, they can be in the water 40 degrees, they've sailed in the water 40 degrees, and they can still right themselves. However, Bayesian did not have that. The Large Yacht Code 2 allowed the vessel to have a curve of less than 90 degrees, and it was based on certain usage of that vessel, right? So they allowed it to be less effective at righting herself from that 90 degree position. Now, as we mentioned before the video, the investigation commissioned a stability and windage study of the yacht. The University of Southampton's Wolfson Unit for Marine Technology and Industrial Aerodynamics undertook the study and first built a stability model of Bayesian that replicated the information contained in the approved SIB Stability Information Booklet. And that booklet was used to run a series of simulations. Now, what their findings were is that the effects of wind on the mast, boom, rigging and upper works of Bayesian had been assessed using the available information in that booklet, as I said, and other information that was available to them. And they said that it was possible, based on their calculations, that the vessel windage of 70.6 knots, the angle of vanishing stability, there was no chance of return to an even keel. So once the vessel went over, there was no chance she would come back if she was hit with winds of 70 knots. But they said even at 63 knots, it could be vulnerable. He says the vulnerabilities are when in the motoring condition with sails lowered, the centerboard raised and 10% consumables on board were not identified in the stability information book carried on board. Consequently, those vulnerabilities were also unknown to either the owner or the crew of Bayesian. So the information that they garnered from doing those simulations was missing from that book, so the crew were unaware that the vessel was vulnerable in those circumstances. The Met Office study, the Met Office is the weather office for the UK. They said local observations indicated the probable transient presence of hurricane force winds well in excess of 64 knots at the time of the accident. These winds were sufficient to knock Bayesian beyond its angle of vanishing stability. Now, some of the things that have been talked about since the very beginning. One of the things, though, that kept coming up time and time again was a video of a CCTV camera, which we used in the reconstruction, actually, showing the vessel, apparently showing the lights going out on that vessel. Now, we always said there was no proof in that video that there was a blackout when the vessel was still upright. The vessel was turning away, it was turning to starboard, and it was just basically being pushed out of the view of that camera. I mean, the visibility was atrocious at the time, and the report states that the vessel's engines only cut out when she was knocked over to 90 degrees. and then the emergency lights came on. So because they had a battery backup of emergency lights. Now we don't know how long they stayed on, but because the vessel sank shortly after, right? But the CCTV footage showing the vessel apparently having a blackout, that's been refuted by this report, and that will have been not just from testimony, that will be from the AMS information, like we said. And one of the things I said from the beginning also is that the use of unqualified deckhands on anchor watches. Now, obviously, this is something that's allowed within the industry because it's a private yacht. It wouldn't be allowed on a commercial yacht. I think that's something that shouldn't be done. Unfortunately, on a vessel of this size, there's only 10 crew. You're limited on how many people you can have aboard. I would say that in those circumstances, they should have people who actually, who are at the very least, have certification to say that they know how to use equipment on board when they're on the bridge. One of the things that I did say from the beginning is that the most likely scenario is that the captain told whoever was on watch on the bridge, if they were unqualified, is to wake me if the wind gets over a certain speed, or if the vessel starts to drag anchor. And that's exactly what was said in this report, that the deckhands were just told to monitor the wind and you know, to if it gets over a certain speed, I think it was 20 knots in that report, to wake the captain up, or if they notice the anchor dragging. And there are systems within the radar that and the ECDIS that you can program it so that if the vessel moves from a certain point, then it will actually alert you to say that the anchor is dragging. Whether or not those deckhands use that system, whether they know how to, whether it was set up for them, that's a question that we don't know at this point either. Now, obviously, this, like I said at the beginning, this report is not a final report, it's an interim report. They haven't had a lot of access to the hull of the vessel, obviously still on the seabed right now. You can see that the platforms here are working right now. There's not an awful lot of work going on today, to be honest, but certainly visible work. I'm not saying that there isn't any work going on inside. They've obviously got systems inside where they can lower, and divers can go down and ROVs can go down from within that platform, so we would never see that. But there's no mechanical lifting of anything that we've seen today. But the MAIB have had very limited access to that hull. Once the vessel has been raised, they're going to take it down the coast here to a place called Termini Amerise, where they're going to put it into a shed, and then they're all going to be able to get access to it. We'll find out then about things like the shell door and stuff, but I think that those things are less important. I mean, they're just as important as they were, but I think a lot of the questions have been answered based on this report. Like I said, as long as those things are proved to be true, and when they pull that hull out of the water, one of the first things we'll probably check is, was that shell door dogged, which I'm sure it will have been. All right, guys, I'm going to wrap up here. This has been a long one. I hope you have found it interesting. Please let us know in the comments what you think. I'm sure you will. Yeah, make sure to like and subscribe and all that jazz. And we'll speak to you again very soon. We're still going to come back to you with the information from the lawyer. It's very interesting. Now that this has come out, it sounds even more unreasonable, what he's been saying. But we'll go into that in a future video. All right, guys. Have a great weekend. We're going to be here over the weekend, so we'll still be putting out videos. So stay tuned, subscribe and all that, and check us out on patreon.com/eSysman as well. All right, guys, thanks for watching, and I'll catch up with you soon. Bye-bye.